Hi there, this is Lindsay Johnson from the Uncommon Conversations team at Worldwide. Thank you for your interest in the second webinar in our series, Measuring Biopharma Confidence. We have worked with Kineticos Life Sciences to survey top executives from biopharmas to create a confidence index and quantify sentiments from our industry. For Q1, we've been discussing key findings with industry experts. Our first webinar covered the fundamentals of running a biopharmaceutical. I'll turn it over to Philip, who will be moderating the second discussion, the impact of AI, machine learning, and new technologies. Enjoy!
I want to thank everybody again for joining us today for our second in a series of weekly panel discussions covering the Q1 edition of the 2020 Biopharma Confidence Index, co-sponsored by Kineticos Life Science and Worldwide Clinical Trials. The Biopharma Confidence Index, or BCI, is intended to be a forward-looking index designed to measure C-suite and executive leadership sentiment in the biopharma industry by asking questions about their confidence levels concerning key issues. We look for the BCI to become a valuable and highly sought-after resource for its key insights across both key industry-related issues and business functions, including capital markets, deal landscape, mergers and acquisitions, clinical development, regulatory affairs, commercialization, and overall business model plans. I want to start today by first thanking our four panelists for joining us. We have Aman Kara, Global Head of Regulatory Strategy for Worldwide Clinical Trials. Aman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We also have Kevin Hampton, Senior Vice President of Biopharma at Kineticos.
Thanks for having me.
Tom Zetlow is also on the line, Operating Executive for Kineticos.
Thank you for having me.
And then last but not least, Dan McCormick, Senior Vice President of Biopharma, also with Kineticos.
Glad to be here, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I'm Philip Galinas. I'm Chief Commercial Officer for Kineticos, and I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Over this quarter, we'll deliver 5 panel discussions covering 5 specific sections of the BCI. With our first discussion panel, we covered the fundamental elements of running a biopharmaceutical. Today, with section 2, we'll cover the impact of new technologies and new approaches to markets. The next section 3 will discuss raising capital and mergers and acquisitions. Section 4 will be all about licensing activities. And finally, section 5 will deal with sales and marketing concepts, political pressures, and overarching economic issues. Today, again, our discussion is section 2 of the BCI survey, the impact of new technologies and new approaches to markets. The data we're sharing today is based on 112 respondents, and we're only presenting those respondents or those responses who acknowledged a confidence level of 8 or above related to a scoring scale from 1, meaning no confidence or not important, all the way to 10 or a high confidence and highly important. Our respondents are C-suite and executive level leaders working for either private, startup, or mid-sized to large pharma companies. So let's get started. Our first set of charted data and questions are about the application of AI, or artificial intelligence, by our respondents, applying to top therapeutic areas that they're responsible for. That included oncology, immuno-oncology, cardiovascular disease, infectious disease, neurology, metabolic conditions, and rare diseases. Looking at the responses, what we see is that companies engaged in cardiovascular disease research clearly value AI and machine learning more than others in other therapeutic indications. There's even a much higher expectation of positive ROI from artificial intelligence investments in the next year with cardiovascular disease, and much less with any of the other indications. So with all that said, the first question is, And I'm going to ask maybe Aman and Kevin to step up and speak to this. Maybe Aman first and then Kevin. But is this due to cardiovascular patients generating so much more data, as in EKGs, blood pressure, etc., which companies may think to use as companion information for these cardiovascular drugs?
Absolutely. So I'm going to take a step back and actually say this whole AI, machine learning, they are considered kind of buzzwords in the healthcare space right now. This survey actually has indicated more drilling down about how cardiovascular disease patients are generating far more data. And that is due to the increased usage of this wearable technology that has become more acceptable. We're now looking at the advent of software as a medical device, and that's coming out more and more. Regulatory agencies are reacting to this new form of data that is coming out that is very relevant, that is a companion to the products in development as well. So this is a very much a growing space. It's not surprising to see cardiovascular indications. They're up there in the index. Oncology coming up as well, more and more. Again, early adopters have been within the cardiovascular space.
I was going to hit on the oncology as well, right? So I think most of the work that I've been involved in is the oncology space. And I quite frankly think it's interesting and would have expected oncology to be higher, maybe up there with neuro, potentially metabolic areas. Just there's so much out there going on with, precision medicine, precision oncology, companion diagnostics. I just would have expected higher ratings. We at Kineticos as advisors have talked to a lot of AI and machine learning companies over the years, and most of them are chasing after oncology targets. But I think the other flip side, and we'll get to a little bit of this maybe later too, is that this could be indicative of some of the challenge that we've experienced in oncology over the past couple of decades. I mean, we've come a very, very, very long way in our battle to cure cancer, but when you look at even where we are today in 2020, and you look at durable response rates, overall response rates, we still haven't cracked the nut, and people may be losing confidence, or it's just not coming through at the rate of something like cardiovascular disease. But I thought that was interesting myself.
I agree with you, Kevin. Given the increase in genomics data over time, especially in the areas that you've just noted, I was a little bit surprised as well by that research and the feedback.
When you look at something like cardiovascular disease, but I can also think about some of the breakthroughs and things that are happening in diabetes right now. You start to think about all the wearables and some of the data that comes out of constant monitoring. I know that has some effect on cardiovascular. Like I said, you also see it in other areas like diabetes, but do you see that playing a large role in where the bigger part of AI and machine learning will have the biggest impact in these different therapeutic areas, and how will that change over time?
I think right now, looking at the index, for example, we see cardiovascular all substantially higher compared to the other spaces. But I still pivot cautiously and saying that I think this is due to the early adoption that has occurred, and there's more buzz in this space, there's more talk about this space. And having said that, of course, oncology and other areas, they are, I wouldn't say trailing behind, but they're not the early adopters. So that confidence level isn't quite there up there. And there's a whole paradigm involved with oncology drug development. More so, cardiovascular is a little bit more, I caution the word, like what I'm using, simplistic, but it's a one and done as such. There's so much more variations involved in other indications, of course. So it's a growing space, and we have to pay attention to it about how this is developing accordingly as well. And data being, I guess you could say, data is a new oil in the landscape and in a global landscape. I think it's only going to, the usage of AI, machine learning is only going to increase with the more data that is flowing into our industry. Those are my brief thoughts.
This is Tom. Oncology may have suffered a little bit from data mining. I was working on a project where a company was looking at a 47 gene companion diagnostic. So they data mined on their who would respond to their drug, but unfortunately that failed in phase 3 because when you're data mining, you can get a lot of spurious effects. So I think there's maybe a gun-shy effect going on in oncology right now.
That makes
Those are really
sense.
good points. Yeah, those are really good points, actually. Yeah.
We'll move on to the second set of data. When we look at this, we're talking about expectations of our respondents would have for artificial intelligence and machine learning to provide breakthroughs in the same therapeutic areas that we've already listed from the first set of data. And that's asking, would they see that happening in the next 3 to 5 years? And also, looking at these respondents and how important will this be as part of the future success for their own companies. So when we look at our responses, what we see is all companies are expecting that artificial intelligence and machine learning will support breakthroughs in these therapies in the near future. However, again, cardiovascular and now also infectious disease seem to expect that AI and machine learning will also be very important in their particular company's success. So the question I have that I'd like to pose, but feel free to speak to the data if you see something interesting there, is where are we as far as CROs preparing to support AI use in drug development? And what do we see as the expectations as far as support for biopharma coming from CROs and consultants in this area? In other words, how can we help our clients? Aman, I'm going to push it over to you again, and then maybe have Kevin follow up, and then we'll go from there.
Absolutely. So my response to this data in front is that CROs are already helping sponsor companies as AI is being used in drug development as we speak. There is discovery being undertaken, discovery of potential assets using AI and machine learning or what have you. And that is again due to the pull or the access of data that there is. And I still pay caution to the winds of disruption as we all hear in this landscape in the development side, is even though you may have discovered a potential asset via AI to start its development journey, that's all well and good, you still need to then fall within the parameters of the development of such a product in the standard kind of regulated environment that we are in. Now, when biopharma actually engage sponsor companies, they are engaging with them for the people's expertise as well. So companies are looking for CROs that are monitoring the landscape, understanding what the nuances are and how regulatory agencies, for example, are responding back. So a solid CRO, they understand not only how to operationalize the development of such a product, but to also help the sponsor company think strategically. So we're thinking discovery, development, and then commercialization as well. And yes, AI is going to break through against all these indications that we've talked about. And it was interesting to look at how rare is up there in the confidence level as well. That's not surprising to me as well. You know, we have to be very, very innovative with the data pull. There are smaller subpopulations, and to be able to get that, you need all the help that you can get. And that is using advances in technology.
To answer the question, how can we help? From our perspective here at Kineticos, I think a lot of it has to do with building awareness and getting these technologies out there, right? So we are firm believers here at Kineticos that there is a place for AI and there is a place for machine learning. It's going to advance our therapeutic development tenfold when it takes up. For one example, we worked with an AI company. They were doing some predictive modeling to help pharma companies recruit patients that would be most likely to respond to any particular therapy. And this was based on big data and all those sorts of things. And so what we did to help them get out there is we went and talked to KOLs, and we, you know, when I say KOLs, I mean leading researchers in this space, and asked these questions. Is there scientific merit behind this? You know, what are the gaps? What are we not thinking about? Where are the blind spots? And so we went through that exercise, and good receptivity from KOLs, but then we got to, you know, so I think our job, at least in this one particular instance was just to get the technology out there and build awareness around it, that these types of technologies are coming. And then I think what we ran into next was when we went out to start engaging with potential pharma adopters, we found that they just weren't ready to invest. And this was 2 or 3 years ago. And the biggest barrier was pharma wanted to see prospective data to see if the tech could truly predict what a drug would do to a patient. And while the company had a lot of retrospective data sets, that's not what pharma was looking for. So I think to our point on the last question, we're going to see a fast follower approach here when it's all said and done. I mean, and that's a very viable strategy. As you'll see the trailblazers of AI machine learning will illuminate some of the speed bumps along the way. So a fast follower approach where you can identify those risks ahead of time and navigate those. I think there's something that could be said there.
To your question around biopharma expectations from CROs and consultants, I think simply what they're looking for is they want to understand how AI, MI is going to make things cheaper, faster, and more effective as it relates to their R&D.
You're right, Dan. We talked about early adoption versus fast followers. I think that's key, the fast followers, because everyone is kind of like waiting to see and then saying, okay, can we learn from other companies' mistakes perhaps, or can we do this better? It is a big, rapidly expanding space with so much data coming in, and the race is on to develop products faster. This journey of developing a product to even take it to commercialization, it takes years. It takes millions and millions of dollars. So anything in order to shorten that time frame, shorten that money, and getting the products out to the patients, that's always a good thing. I'm quite keen to look at this space accordingly, and I do follow this space a lot to understand who's really going to be a fast follower, who are the early adopters as well, because those are the ones that are really paving that way forward about how products can be developed.
Aman, I think that's absolute, and both from the point of worldwide, but also Kineticos is when you engage these clients and they're trying to understand how best to leverage or apply artificial intelligence, machine learning is quickly trying to understand and discern where do they fit between that early adopter characteristic versus that fast follower, and making sure that you're positioning them in a way that they feel comfortable that you're trying to work with them on the way that they want to look at applying these technologies and making sure that you meet their expectations. But it is important to understand, are they part of that early adopter group? Or are they going to be part of that fast follower? And then there's always the others that lag behind.
Absolutely. Yeah, we haven't even talked about them, but you never know. Fast following, early adopters, they might be the ones that they might be more cautious, but at the same time, they might actually get ahead in the race as well. So that's what I'm saying. This is going to be a very interesting space to watch for.
Yeah, the more apparent that AI and machine learning is to the biopharma is that it's going to help them improve their target identification, their safety and efficacy assessments, et cetera. The more apparent that is, the better, and the more adoption we'll see.
We'll move to our third set of data. And this data we charted and asked questions. We asked about expectations of our respondents that they will apply artificial intelligence and machine learning and how it will become a useful tool for them, looking in areas such as preclinical in their clinical work and all the way out to their commercial planning and development and execution. We asked for those responses both in the next 12 months, but also out for the next 5 years. And responses suggested that applications for AI machine learning are expected to become more prevalent in the next few years, both in preclinical and clinical, but also in the commercial sphere, all those activities. So Dan, obviously with your background in commercial, and Kevin thought maybe we'd pair you guys up. But first, Dan, is it surprising that AI and machine learning are perceived as useful tools in both these spheres?
Yeah, I think across the value chain from R&D through manufacturing to commercial launch and then patient engagement, across that continuum, we all have a strong sense that AI can be quite beneficial. It's not surprising to me, from a commercial perspective, that there continues to be good energy there, especially as biopharma really works diligently to figure out how best to bring the right information to the right providers or the right stakeholders, healthcare professionals at the right time via the right channel, and how do you orchestrate your customer engagement from a biopharma's perspective. And there's a lot of conviction, and that's evidenced by departments solely devoted to orchestrating that customer engagement, and they know the avenue for best doing that is leveraging AI to make heads or tails of all of the data that's available to them from the various customer interfacing channels that biopharma currently leverages. So I'm not surprised.
If you asked me 6 months ago, I would have expected AI to be much more relevant to the clinical development, but that's clearly not the case. That was one takeaway for me. And then I think if you just look at the data on the clinical side, it tells me there's still some upside, right? Where people are confident 5-year outlook is better than what it is today. Again, I think to me, oncology strikes me a little low here, but I think we've talked about some of the reasons that might be the case. And also, I guess one other thing to kind of potentially take away from this is if you look at cardiovascular on the clinical side and also infectious disease, one could make an argument that what we've seen in AI to date is what we're going to see, and there are much more advancements coming down the road. It's hard for me to believe that would play out that way, but it seems that there's those two therapeutic areas I think have seen advances early on and are closer to peak than the others.
I'm going to pinpoint rare a little bit out there. I'm going to cast that out a bit. And I see with that increasing concentration from regulatory agencies, for example, and patient advocacy groups as well, they want faster treatments. Okay, so maybe we ask this question in another year or so. This might actually hinge that cardiovascular kind of goes down because that data has been, it's quick and fast, right? You've got the wearable technology, but the really cool, funky stuff actually, I think is going to occur when you have to truly look at the data sources and, to try to pull out and tell the right story in order to go back to the regulatory agencies, for example, for development of such a product. So I'm patiently waiting to see how this is going to develop.
Just wanted a follow-up question. It almost seems like to some point this AI machine learning has almost a feedback loop where the commercial side feeds back to the clinical side, and being able to look at this in two separate areas of the business, you're not going to do that anymore, that you're actually going to see a continuous loop between commercial back to clinical and then back to commercial, where maybe before that didn't happen.
Absolutely. Before, I feel that there has been development, whether you're looking at, it's been a bit siloed, to be honest.
Yes.
It's been like, where clinical is doing their part and then, you pass the ball on to commercial, but then they haven't talked and they haven't strategized. So this technology, this advancements are only going to help break down those silos so that, when you're developing a product, you're thinking more about commercialization because you have more access to the data. Now, how you read that data is another story, of course, how technology, AI is going to build upon that. We'll see what happens. But yes, I can see silos being broken down for sure.
Thank you, guys. We'll move on to our fourth set of data. What we've got here, we charted out data and asked questions about our respondents' views on the importance versus their confidence and then their view of risk when they're considering R&D innovation. We first looked at the overall importance, confidence, and risk for all companies. And then what we wanted to do afterwards, we broke out that same data, but we looked at it by the three groups that I spoke of at the beginning. Our companies considered startups, those considered private, and then our large to mid-sized companies. And if you look into the data, what you see is we know that R&D innovation has always been the bedrock of the pharmaceutical industry for decades. And the respondents seem that they're very confident in both the importance and the execution in the future. but there's some limited concerns about risk. So looking at the importance, the confidence, and then what you see with risk, is there any surprise based on the current attitudes that we're seeing in the customer base? And I would just follow up with this question, with any innovation, there's got to be risk to consider. So why the lower response to risk? What should we helping our clients to prepare for? And how do we help them understand how to deal with that risk?
Thanks, Philip. When I'm looking at the data, I was quite surprised to see risk not as high as the importance and the confidence. And you're right, R&D innovation has been the bedrock, and with innovative companies, innovative technologies, there are emerging biopharma, there is existing biopharma actually that has sometimes pivoted to a direction or concentration. They're doing this with their eyes wide open. So that gives me a sense of how they understand the importance and and their confidence about that as well. What concerns me a little bit is how the industry should also be looking at ways to de-risk. Biopharma is also doing that as well. You have an asset in development. Should you be exploring not just one particular disease or indication? Should you perhaps be branching out so early on to make sure that you're not going down one road but then realizing that it might not be that right road, which is, hey, this is all technological advances would come very useful. But journeying down this development pathway, this is a long, expensive journey. And I'm not saying putting your eggs in one basket, that again, a very simplistic approach. What I'm saying is early engagement and dialogue, how to de-risk your program or your asset. Should you be having early engagement? Should you be having early engagement and dialogue with agencies, not just one, globally as well? Can you, should you use expedited pathways? Because you have to balance this out with how the return in investment occurs when it comes to commercialization. You need to look about the reimbursement perspective, the payer perspective, globally that comes into mind. So I'm interested to hear other panelists' thoughts as well. Maybe we can have a little mini discussion about this.
There's a couple lenses you could look at the risk. I guess for me, just looking at the data, right? So you're at just over 7 on importance and confidence, and then you're at 5.5 or so on the risk. So yes, while it's lower, to me, it's not that significant of a variance. And I think Aman made a good point to the extent that you can de-risk from a CRO perspective or from our perspective here at Kineticos, our job, and I think a component of every strategy project we do here at Kineticos is helping our clients illuminate and quantify risk. And then the second part to that is defining strategies to mitigate those risks. So nearly all the work that we do at Kineticos is helping our clients identify where those risks are and helping them navigate around them. So even though that we've been working in these spaces for decades in oncology or cardiovascular infectious disease, you would think that we know what all the risks are, we know how to mitigate them, but that's not true. We're uncovering new and unknown risks every day as we develop drugs. And then that's kind of my thing on the risk. And then as far as how it's broken down by company size, I think the spread from large to startup or private is not truly reflected here. I think we're seeing some bias. I think we all can agree, maybe not, but I think I can say that it's apparent to me at least that how poor innovation has gotten within the walls of pharma. And now innovation is just outsourced through gobbling up smaller companies. So I think true innovation within the large pharmaceutical sector has gotten pretty poor, and I'm quite surprised that it's marginally below where we are with startups and private. I think we're going to see some bias come out through this data again because this is a bit of a self-assessment. I don't have any statistic in front of me, but I know there's data out there on how many of these approved drugs are being driven by internal programs at big pharma versus how many of them have started in some of these smaller companies or even academia. So that was interesting to me as well.
I don't want to speak for you, Dan, but I know your background, you have a lot of history with large pharma, and I just thought it was interesting as Kevin's talking about the importance and the confidence just slightly lower, but the risk is somewhat higher. And if you do think about big pharma, they're more risk averse probably than these smaller companies.
Yeah, I do agree with you from a big biopharma perspective. The level of risk that where there's a willingness to take it on is much less. And in my experience, I've seen a good bit of risk aversion.
thinking about working with, let's say, virtual biotechs versus large pharma, and knowing how they are each set up. And I see that there's more nimbleness, sometimes in a smaller company of a company of N equals 5. And they're sometimes a bit more braver, I feel, that they're thinking about how to get there faster a bit more. And, larger companies, more functions, more people involved, more having to get approved, more levels, more layers. So it's interesting to see. And again, I think there is some bias involved in this. You're completely right. And I'd love for this to be shown in another year or so because it's so fast moving.
All right, well, why don't we move on? We're actually to our fifth and final set of data. What we looked at here was we charted out data and asked questions about our respondents' views, again, regarding innovation, but very specific as to whether gene editing will be a powerful new approach in multiple therapeutic areas over the next 12 months and out to 5 years. And then we asked the same question 12 months out to 5 years, whether or not CAR T will enable actual targeting into solid tumors. Now, that was first asked of all respondents, but then we stepped back and we thought, well, why don't we ask those same questions and look for the responses for our specific oncology companies as far as responding to those same questions. So what we see from the data shows that all the companies pretty much expect that these new technologies in gene editing and solid tumor effective CAR T therapies will be successful within the next 5 years versus 12 months. But I asked the question, and looking at the data, especially as we carved out the oncology companies, wouldn't you have expected that the oncology companies would have been more confident instead of just slightly less confident? They were actually slightly less confident about the solid tumor CAR T breakthroughs as compared to the overall companies. So again, is this somewhat of a surprise that the oncology companies seem to be less confident about solid tumor CAR T breakthroughs versus the overall industry?
There's a lot of talk about this space. It's a CAR T cell therapy, gene editing, very exciting space to be in. We can look where we were 5 years ago to, for example, where we are now. This space is exploding. I think that those directly involved in the space are able to understand the complexities in the space as well, more so. You only have to look at the public domain to see that there are many trials, many assets in development in this space, hundreds. And I'm going to flip this a little bit. I'm going to say maybe more so oncology, let's just do a snapshot, but then let's turn it around and say maybe other companies are actually watching very carefully what the oncology space is doing so that they are trying to understand. And that speaks to the data that we were getting before about, for example, oncology is they might be adopting at a later pace. They are more caution, I think, more risk averse oncology companies because they're directly involved in the space. They understand the complexities. Trials are expensive. Materials can be expensive. Logistics need careful consideration. And at the same time, lots of items going on in this world, but they are truly being the experimental therapy. That confidence, I think, is a true snapshot, in my opinion. But for me, looking outside of the oncology companies, they're just watching very carefully what is happening in the oncology space as well. So they are well aware of how things are going to be occurring. So I don't know. I have a different angle I'm looking at this maybe.
I like that angle too, and that's kind of the angle I was going to take, or similar. I think what we have here are almost two counter forces, right? In theory, oncology companies should be thinking more about CAR T and confident in breakthroughs because it's relevant, it's what they're working on, it's what they're investing in, so on and so forth. But you also have to keep in mind that these are the same people that, similar to what I mentioned above, they have for every one minor success, and whether that's, breakthrough therapy or preclinical data or manufacturing capabilities, you have 10, 20, 30, 40 failures that are just continuing to push some of these down towards the earth, right? So I think if you're not an oncology company, you could be looking at this as, hey, look, these people know what they're doing. I'm keeping an eye on the news and seeing more positive than negative. But if you're living that every day, you're experiencing all the challenges and difficulties, I think that confidence could eventually start morph into, indifference or even possibly skepticism, right? And I think that's why, again, if you try to find a silver lining in that, if you can, that's why it's great to see so many new biotechs being funded, right? So with an area that's as difficult as oncology or CAR T, and as a subset of oncology, I think it just comes down to more shots on goal. And so the more shots on goal we get via all these new and emerging startup companies, we'll be in a better place. Because if you're I don't think anything told on the phone today that success rates in oncology are going to get up there to where they need to be and even cured. But so I think shots on goal becomes a component here.
Good point, Kevin. And Dan, anything to add to that?
I'm not surprised by the data and the respondent feedback here. We've got real evidence out there with companies that worked really hard to trailblaze in this place. You can think of two trailblazers that went on for big time acquisitions. The very first of which had some issues very early on. Lots of promise, then some challenges with some unfortunate circumstances impacting a few patients, and put the company back on its heels. They were able to overcome that, go on to two subsequent acquisitions. Very promising and encouraging. Nonetheless, the oncology community is well aware it's hard, it's complex to get this right. And another trailblazer recently, some news around the market uptake. While it's a market, it is well below what the acquirer had anticipated. And so that's kind of, got some folks scratching their head a bit and figuring, okay, how do we solve for this? How do we make the right decisions up front without spending billions a couple of years in? Having to figure out how do you make up for the significantly lower revenues that were expected. And then we've got another recent example just last week, another trailblazer in this space, regulatory approval ex-US in the EU, and some unexpected hurdles here in the US. So it's not easy. And those that are really successful recognize that's real hard work. And to the earlier points that we've just been talking about, you got to be prudent. And it's not surprising that there's some risk aversion even impacting this space.
Well, guys, thank you so much for your participation. It was a lively conversation, a lot of great insights and thoughts. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our second BCI panel discussion covering impact of new technologies and new approaches to the market. Again, I want to especially thank our panelists for their participation. These BCI panel discussions are brought to you by Kineticos Life Science and Worldwide Clinical Trials. I would ask you to join us next week for our third installment when we will be discussing raising capital and mergers and acquisitions. So until then, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, Philip.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion on the impact of new technologies on the biopharmaceutical industry. Just as Philip mentioned, the discussions will continue, so please check back soon for the third webinar in the series. I guarantee you're going to like it. And if you want to learn more about Worldwide and the services we can provide, go to worldwide.com. For more information on Kineticos, please go to kineticos.com. Thanks.